Hello, everybody. It's Susan Hepburn here, and this is part two of the first lecture in HDFS 607, Prevention Science Across the Lifespan. Every so often, I hope to pull out a professional context or a set of professional skills associated with being a prevention scientist so that we can make sure that this class is as applied as possible. So today, since you're reading documents that came from task forces, I thought we would talk about task forces and living documents. So the Biglin et al. Article is the result of a task force established by the Society for Prevention Science Standards of Knowledge, which was established in 2005. This particular task force was funded by an NIH R13 mechanism, which still exists. And if you find yourself working in a new area and want to try to bring lots of different minds together to create a document that would either guide a field, guide a particular type of inquiry, or address a specific problem, you may find that you want to apply for an R13 grant to be able to convene this meeting of experts. An R13 grant is a relatively small amount of money, several thousand probably, but the idea would be that you're, in a sense, funding a conference. You're paying for the time of leaders in the field to meet together. You're paying for their travel expenses if they actually leave home, or you're paying for a video conference kind of convention where you are going to have a very specific agenda and develop a very specific product. In writing an R13 grant, you're going to have specific aims of your task force and deliverables, things that you promise to produce as a part of the task force. It is often these deliverables that make the federal government interested in investing. Usually, a task force is comprised by leaders of a certain field, if it's run by NIH. Oftentimes, in other contexts, like in the area of public health or in other areas of psychology and behavioral science, you may find that there are task forces are comprised half of leaders academically or researchers and half lay people or real life individuals who are impacted by the problem that you're discussing. Now, sometimes these could be consumers of a particular prevention science program, or they could be people who are working on the practice end, who can really inform the researchers about what things are like on the ground, what's really happening in the world. So, task forces are usually comprised of a combination of leaders in some way, either lay people or scientists, and usually one needs to be invited to join a task force. If during the course of your career you are invited to join a task force, find out if it's around an issue that you're interested in and that you believe you have some expertise to add to. This is a really great opportunity, usually professionally, in my opinion, because it allows you to really focus on a key aspect of interest, and it allows you to contribute in some way to moving the field forward. You will also find that it can really open your mind and help you see a problem from several different perspectives, because it's a really rare and wonderful opportunity to be in the presence of 20 or 30 other people who care a lot about the same topic but have a different perspective than you do. So as much as you'll contribute to a task force, I find you also learn from and are developed by your experiences in task forces. So I've spent time in task forces at the state level, like the Colorado Department of Education had a task force to try to improve educational identification. So we would meet quarterly for several years until we figured out how to approach the problem. That task force was comprised of 2 or 3 academic researchers like myself, and then some administrative leaders of districts, some administrative leaders at the state level, and then some parents, as well as some individuals with disabilities who'd been through the system. Most task forces operate within a time frame. So the task force that you read about for prevention science, they spent about 6 years meeting once a year at the American Psychology Conference, I believe, in order to collaborate on that first document. They then established it as a formal document to return to and revise over time. And this is what they mean by a living document. In my experience on the Colorado Department of Education task force, our mission was appointed by the state government, and we were a 3-year task force. We met 4 times a year, and our product was to create an interactive website and a set of guidelines that would be used across the state to guide the educational identification process, which is basically what we do in special education to figure out who needs special education, and if so, what is the condition or disorder that's bringing them to special education. So, a time limited activity with people with diverse perspectives who know something about the topic with a formal product at the end. Now, in the case of NIH, unlike the 6-year process, I was a part of an NIH task force that I think is more common these days. This is a task force that was basically to run. The preparation period was about 6 to 9 months, where a small committee, there were 4 of us, tried to put together an agenda for this working meeting, with the idea being that our goal was to come up with guidelines for how to address scientific priorities in mental health in developmental disabilities. So we had a committee working on who should be in our task force, what topics should we cover, what presentations do we need. That went on for about 6 to 9 months. Once we invited people and actually ran the task force, we ran it across 2 days. And in the NIH model at this time, this was 2014, the task force was actually run by experienced scientists who were program officers within the National Institutes of Health. And a lot of our work comes into 2 sub-institutes, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, NICHD, and the National Institute of Mental Health. So as you can see from this agenda, in our 2-day conference, we started with opening remarks. We were all together in Washington, D.C. They flew us all in. There were about 30 of us sitting around a round table with like official name tags in front of you. And we took turns listening to each other do presentations on different topics. So there would be anywhere from a half hour to 45 minutes devoted to a topic, where the committee who ran the task force had some overarching questions for the speakers to cover. And the facilitators were there to make sure that we all kept to the time frame. As somebody who was a part of planning this one, I was also then put in charge of moderating a part of the program. And one of the things I learned about the task of moderation is to make sure that you are in a lot of contact with the speakers who are contributing to your panel, because you want to make sure that the speakers that you've chosen are going to each provide a different set of information. We have really limited time in 2 days to try to get a lot of information discussed. So if you're covering something like what are the standards of knowledge of prevention science and you only have a limited time, you want to use that time well. Well, our topic was family-centered approaches, looking at family systems and the integration of care. So I had found 2 speakers who were leaders in our field. One was going to talk about parenting stress and how to improve mental health when you were working with older parents and adults. That was Dr. Malik. Dr. McIntyre was focusing on younger children. So we were able to keep them complementary and non-overlapping. And then I tried to bring in combination of the 2 and to focus more on the aspects of the intervention, the psychosocial intervention we were doing. So we tried to address our overarching questions. In the way this task force went, we would present our material for, let's say, 45 minutes and then have 15 minutes for discussion and question. So the people in the task force would be watching, taking notes, and usually asking questions right in the middle, or holding them to the end if you preferred. Sometimes in these task force meetings, it'll culminate with an action item. So for us on day 2, they did a special event where they had what they called a round robin, where they brought in 10 different organizations and agencies that were involved in this particular issue. You can see that list of organizations right here. They also brought in the federal partners from other institutes that were also relevant. So the attendees at this 1-hour session like tripled. So we had many, many more people in the room participating and listening. Meanwhile, the core group of scientists was also present. The overarching questions for this last session were, well, what is your agency or organization's mission with regard to our topic, mental health and IDD? In this way, the scientists in the room got to learn from the people who were out there in the real world so that they could make sure that the ideas that they were putting together from those scientific talks actually had real world relevance. So they talked about their activities, their mission, and what they could contribute to the overall goal. Now, the reason that I put in the rest of this, one of the other things that happens with a task force, especially if it's a local one and you're meeting in person, or a federal one and you actually get to travel, which isn't as common these days, there's a social aspect to task force work, which is important to pay attention to. Now, admittedly, I'm a bit of a natural introvert. I would rather do anything than go to a cocktail party or make small talk, especially with scientists that I revere and respect and I'm going to become tongue-tied in front of. What I've learned over time is that it's really important to push yourself, if you're an introvert, to be social during the breaks, during the working lunches, during the dinners. It's really important to show up for those things. Now, if you're somebody like me that needs to take a little break, get your energy together before you're ready to be super social, you can pick and choose those times. You need to build in that caregiving, but do try to push yourself to be there for the unstructured times because it is as you might imagine, the more you get to know your fellow task group members, the deeper your conversations can go, I think, about science or otherwise. And you may find when you're on a task force, you're meeting people who care about some of the same things that you do. And building those relationships will also be an important part of building your professional network. And you may find that you return to those individuals years later. So I have a couple of friends, for example, that I met in these brief scientific task force activities that I've never spent time with outside of a formal meeting, but I feel completely comfortable writing to them and asking for advice or a question about a topic that I know is in their purview more than mine. And I think they feel the same. I also find that these networks become places where I'm often asked to write letters for people I served with. When I was going up for promotion, I could identify people nationally from these activities. So as a prevention scientist, I encourage you to avail yourself of these techniques, of these opportunities, and if you are an extroverted person and the social part comes easily, kudos to you. If you need to push yourself to do it, think of it as a time-limited thing that you can totally do for a short period of time. So, to summarize, how do I think you can contribute to a task force effectively? These are just my ideas to throw out there. First, be prepared. I think it's helpful to look up the names of the people you're going to be serving with, read up on the topics that they might be talking about, and make sure that you are refreshed on your own expertise. In fact, when you are invited to join a task force, ask the person inviting you what they are hoping for from your potential contribution. So identify the ways that you might be able to contribute and participate in planning the activities that are relevant to that. I'd say 8 times out of 10, you won't be a part of the planning committee. You will just be a participant. But if you are planning, make sure that those planning activities are directly related to what it is you have to offer. As you might imagine, it's important to be as professional as possible in these activities. Task forces are things that busy professionals are doing in addition to their regular work. There's usually an honorarium or a stipend involved, especially if it's a funded task force like NIH's. So when I served with the state, there was no money in that, but when I was asked to do a federal one, I believe the NIH daily rate was either 300 or 500, and that just helps to reinforce the time you're putting in. But you want to make sure that you're completing the tasks that you say you'll do on time. You want to be sure to communicate with the leaders and members efficiently. Try to learn their names and their roles. And I think this is really important. In a task force, it is so important to listen actively, to stay open and be ready to change your mind. You could be discussing really controversial things. You could have a very strong opinion about something. You could have some very strong biases in a certain direction. Being aware of where your biases are, where your mindset is an important professional skill, as we know. And it'll be vital to try to keep an open mind and actively listen to your colleagues. By actively listening, I also mean you wouldn't believe how far it goes when you show the nonverbal behaviors of active listening, when you look at the speaker, when you nod at certain points, when you take notes. Don't fake it. Actively do it. You are there to listen and contribute. So active listening is really important. It's also important, as you might imagine, to give credit to others when you are discussing ideas and contributions. We can get caught up in the substance of ideas, and it's a really good practice to make sure that you are, in a sense, orally citing people like you would in a written paper. Now, I find because task forces usually have a limited period of time and a lot to accomplish, that it's really good if every single member adds comments only when they have something novel and relevant to say. I'm a big believer in listening more and speaking less often, but when you talk, having something substantive to add. Try to avoid multitasking and looking at your devices. If you need to multitask, it can often be better to either wait for a break, which there will be several of them, or excuse yourself and do it outside of the room. That can be better than looking like you're not paying attention. You also want to ask relevant questions in the group and relegate some of your questions to follow-up emails. So think hard about, is the question I'm about to ask relevant to everybody in this room, or is it just for me? And if so, follow up with that either in person on a break or as an email. It can be very helpful if you are presenting to a task force to have a one-page summary that will complement your presentation. These days we might share things electronically as well as a hard copy, but I find if I'm going to speak to a group and I've got 30 slides I'm going to cover in an hour, if I can reduce my main points to a one-pager, I'm much more likely to have people recall what I have to say because I can leave that document with them. They'll look at one page more than they'll look at your whole slides. And lastly, as you might imagine, pretty common sense, in a task force, it can be quite a lot of discussion and dialogue. Try to accept the feedback that you receive graciously, even when it's hard. You may get people who don't necessarily have the best social skills just coming right at you from a scientific standpoint, and you may have a good point to be able to debate back to. You can certainly go back and forth and engage in rigorous debate. But it's also important to acknowledge that other viewpoint graciously and really make sure that you're listening to what that person is trying to say. And always admit when you don't know the answer to a question. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know, I will look into it. Or to turn to the crowd and say, does anybody have any input for that question? That is always fine. So, hopefully that's given us a good start on how to think about task forces. And as you consider this, what else should guide your behavior in a task force context? We'll discuss some of these things as we move ahead in the professional skills part of our classes. Thank you for your attention.